It begins not with a crash, but with a dream of a house, a steady job, and a better life. For generations, it was the promise that defined America, that hard work, thrift, and faith in progress would guarantee prosperity. It powered the nation through wars, depressions, and revolutions in technology. But what if that dream, so deeply rooted in the national story, has quietly become a mirage? What if prosperity no longer grows from effort, but from credit? The American dream was once built on productivity. Today, it's built on debt. And the question haunting the 21st century is whether a society can keep believing in a dream that its own economy can no longer deliver. To understand how this illusion took hold, we have to go back to when it was real. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States stood alone as the world's industrial giant. Europe and Asia lay in ruins, while American factories ran day and night. The GI Bill offered veterans low-interest loans and education, turning soldiers into homeowners and students. Suburbs bloomed around cities, linked by Eisenhower's new interstate highways. A single income could buy a house, raise a family, and build savings. The 1950s became the golden era of middle-class prosperity, an economy where wages rose with productivity, unions protected workers, and manufacturing jobs provided dignity. The American dream wasn't just an idea, it was an equation that worked. But equations can change. In the 1970s, the world that made America rich began to fracture. Foreign competition returned. Oil prices quadrupled. Factories moved abroad to cut costs, and inflation eroded real wages. For the first time in modern history, the average American worker's pay stopped rising even as productivity kept growing. Families adapted not by cutting back, but by borrowing. Credit cards, once a luxury, became survival tools. Women entered the workforce in record numbers to keep household income afloat. Dual-income families replaced the single breadwinner model, not out of ambition, but necessity. Beneath the surface of suburban stability, debt began to replace wage growth as the fuel of prosperity. At the same time, finance itself was changing. The deregulation wave of the 1980s turned Wall Street into the new engine of American growth. Banks, once restrained by Depression-era laws, were freed to speculate, merge, and expand. The real economy, factories, farms, production, began to shrink in importance compared to the paper economy of stocks, bonds, and derivatives. The 1980s celebrated the ownership society, but ownership increasingly meant leverage. Homes were no longer just places to live. They were investment vehicles. College became a path not only to knowledge but to lifelong debt. Consumption replaced savings as the measure of success. Greed is good, said Gordon Gekko, the fictional symbol of an era that confused wealth creation with wealth extraction. By the 1990s, a new chapter opened. The Cold War ended, globalization accelerated, and cheap imports flooded the market. Inflation stayed low, but so did wages. Easy credit filled the gap. Mortgage-backed securities, credit expansion, and a growing belief in financial innovation allowed millions to live beyond their means. Technology promised efficiency, yet its rewards flowed upward. The stock market boom of the late 1990s made millions feel richer, at least on paper. The wealth effect drove spending, but the benefits were concentrated. Between 1980 and 2000, the top 1% doubled its share of national income, while the middle stagnated. The American dream was becoming a lottery ticket, still alive, but harder to win. Then came the 2000s, when illusion finally overtook reality. The housing market became the new miracle. fueled by ultra-low interest rates and deregulated lending. Anyone could get a mortgage. Anyone could own. Homes were flipped like stocks. Prices soared not because people earned more, but because they borrowed more. Politicians on both sides praised the rise in home ownership as proof of prosperity. Yet behind the scenes, the system was rotting. Subprime loans were packaged, rated AAA, and sold around the world. Wall Street had turned the American dream into a financial derivative. When the bubble burst in 2008, it revealed the truth. The foundation of prosperity had been hollowed out. Millions lost their homes. Trillions vanished from global markets. The middle class, already fragile, was shattered. In the aftermath, the government stepped in, not to rebuild the old dream, but to preserve the system that had destroyed it. The Federal Reserve slashed rates to zero, printed trillions, and bailed out the financial sector. Asset prices recovered, but wages did not. The decade that followed saw record highs in the stock market and record lows in household savings. The top 10%, who owned most financial assets, gained enormously. For everyone else, the recovery felt like standing still. The American dream survived, but only as branding, not as balance sheets. Meanwhile, costs that once defined middle-class life, housing, healthcare, and education, rose far faster than income. The average college graduate in 2020 carried more than $30,000 in student debt. The median home price reached 6 times the median household income, compared to just twice in 1950. Health insurance, once an employment benefit, became a burden. In real terms, the middle class was financing its lifestyle by mortgaging its future. And as debt piled up, the idea of making it shifted from ownership to survival. The dream hadn't disappeared, it had been privatized. The pandemic only accelerated the transformation. When the world shut down in 2020, the U.S. government injected more liquidity into the system than at any point in history. Stock markets boomed while millions lost jobs. The wealth of billionaires surged by over 70% between March 2020 and 2022. For many, the economy seemed to exist on a different planet than their daily lives. Yet even this was hailed as recovery. As long as asset prices stayed high, the illusion of prosperity held. But behind the numbers, inequality widened to levels unseen since the Gilded Age. Today, the American dream still decorates political speeches and advertising slogans. But the data tells another story. Median real wages have barely risen since the 1970s. 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Nearly 40% cannot cover a $400 emergency without borrowing. The economy grows, but the benefits pool at the top. For most, growth now means working more to afford less. The dream that once united a nation has become a mirror of its divide. And yet, the mythology endures because it serves a purpose. It keeps faith alive in a system that demands belief to function. Just as the gold standard once relied on trust in metal, today's economy relies on trust in credit. Consumers must spend. Borrowers must borrow. Markets must rise. Confidence is the last remaining currency, and as long as it holds, the illusion can continue. But history teaches that illusions, no matter how grand, eventually meet arithmetic. The collapse of the American dream is not a single event, but a slow erosion of wages, savings, and meaning. It is the quiet transformation of a nation from a society of builders to a society of borrowers. But this story is not over. For every illusion, there comes a reckoning. The question is whether America can rediscover the substance beneath its symbols before the system that sustains them runs out of trust. Three truths remain. First, prosperity built on credit is temporary. Only productivity creates real wealth. Second, inequality is not a side effect. It is a signal of imbalance, the early tremor before collapse. And third, belief can sustain an economy longer than logic allows, but never forever. If this story made you see the world differently, subscribe to Economic Collapse. Because every empire, every system, and every dream ends the same way. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet realization that what we thought was prosperity was only the reflection of our faith.